After about 36 months of breaking Ebola cases, Congo has reported an outbreak again. 28 suspected cases have been recorded, according to provisional figure, and 15 people died since the end of August, the health minister said on Thursday. It is a relief that the current outbreak strain has vaccine. It is the Zaire strain, one of the 6 Ebola strains that exist. The challenge now is deploying logistics to get vaccines to every corner, according to health authorities. We recall, deadliest outbreak in the DRC killed nearly 2,300 people between 2018 and 2020. After about 36 months of breaking Ebola cases, Congo has reported an outbreak again. 28
Welcome to This Week in Africa, your weekly live stream where we talk about Africa's news and its impact on the African continent and the diaspora. Today, we're talking about the deadly Ebola outbreak that killed 15 in the Congo, and also the U.S. deporting migrants to African crisis zones, and those folks even in some cases being repatriated in other places. Before we get into today's stories, I will turn it over to my co-host to introduce herself before I introduce myself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gloria Ayo. I am the creator and host of The African Story. Very happy to be here.
Welcome back. And I am Joe Hatagwa from Authentic African, founder and CEO of Authentic African. Our goal is to get people to visit, move, and invest in Africa. And the goal is to bridge the gap between the two groups, people living on the continent and those living in the diaspora. And we do that with news stories such as the ones we will be reviewing today. So as you saw at the top, there is a deadly Ebola virus outbreak once again in the DRC, and we're going to talk about it a bit more. So specifically, what we saw, as you saw, is health authorities in the Democratic Republic of Congo have declared an outbreak of Ebola virus in the, Kasai province, where 28 suspected cases and 15 people were unalived, including 4 healthcare workers who have been reported that was reported as of the 4th of September, 2025. So we'll get into a video and then have some commentary on the other side.
Has fallen over Central Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo has declared a new outbreak of Ebola, with at least about 15 people already dead. In a country pushed to its limits by conflict, health teams are now in a pretty desperate race to contain one of the world's most feared diseases. Now, Ebola is a hemorrhagic fever born from a virus. It is transmitted to humans from animals. Fever, muscle pain, vomiting, diarrhea. A cruel progression leads to internal bleeding, organ failure, and it spreads through blood and bodily fluids and not by air. The patients remain infectious once symptoms appear, making rapid isolation vital. Now, for the Democratic Republic of Congo, this is alarmingly familiar terrain. Ebola has struck repeatedly. There have been 15 Ebola outbreaks since 1976. Violence, poverty, and mistrust make containment brutal. Health workers face danger. Local communities resist. Supplies run short, and the fragile system frays under each crisis. The global responders have mobilized the World Health Organization, which is deploying experts, testing labs, PPE treatments, and the ERVEBO vaccine to stem the tide. Community outreach and surveillance are also being ramped up. And yet, as Congo continues to fight on, the virus knows few limits, threatening lives and draining hope, and raising fears of yet another catastrophic spread.
Okay, we'll leave it there and give our thoughts. So, Gloria, what are your thoughts on this new outbreak and the impact it's having on the DRC?
Yeah, first, I'm sending healing energy to all those affected by this outbreak. The name of the strain is Zaire Ebola virus, and it's actually named after Zaire, which is the former name of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That was actually where the first known outbreak in 1976 was discovered, near the Ebola River. Now, some might wonder why Ebola keeps resurfacing. And here is a possible explanation. Traditionally, Ebola outbreaks were thought to begin with when the virus jumps from an animal host, such as a fruit bat, to a human. And this happens when people come in direct contact with infected wildlife. It could be during hunting, during butchering, it could be through them eating bushmeat. But we now know that since the 2014 to 2016 West Africa outbreak, which is actually the largest Ebola outbreak in history, we now know that Ebola can actually persist in areas of the body where the immune system doesn't aggressively attack, such as the eyes, the brain, spinal fluid, and especially semen. So survivors can carry dormant Ebola virus in these regions for months or even years after recovering. Now, if the virus wakes up, it can cause disease in that person or be transmitted to others without any new contact with animals. This happened in Guinea in 2021 when 12 people lost their lives to an outbreak. They found out later that the virus had matched strains from that 2014 outbreak, meaning it didn't come from animals, but from a human survivor carrying the virus silently for at least 5 years. So it could be a fresh spillover from wildlife or a reemergence from a previous attack through a survivor or a silent carrier. So controlling Ebola isn't just about preventing animal to human transmission. It also requires long-term monitoring of survivors, educating people in the community and ensuring that surveillance is in place to quickly trace where each outbreak originates. So that way, we're able to have a hold, we're able to control this really, really awful epidemic.
All great information. Yeah. And I was unaware until you just mentioned the fact that it can lie dormant in those survivors. And, most people recognize how violently it attacks people who do not survive. And those who do even still deal with many of the same symptoms. But the fact that it can lie dormant and come out later leads many people to believe I would imagine would lead many people to believe in what now I'm starting to think is what happened here in this instance. Just because it was something that was meant to be eradicated and what we thought was eradicated over the last couple of years. Many of the NGOs that are operating on the continent of Africa came into play in 2014 and 2015 or grew during that time because their goal was to help eradicate the Ebola virus. And I knew friends who worked at many of these NGOs, specifically here in Sierra Leone, because there was an outbreak here in Sierra Leone. Who their businesses went under because they no longer had the Ebola outbreak to work on.
Yeah.
It's scary to know that there's a potential for it to come back. They do have a jab for this particular one, and it seems as though they're administering it, and it has a particular cure or they can inoculate people from it. So we will see if they're able to contain it and stop its spread. So we'll keep a close eye on this and keep you guys all posted as time goes on and if we see anything changing around this particular strain or the virus in general. So stay tuned. We will definitely keep you guys posted as time goes on. Now, with that, I want to move on to the next story, which is still in the DRC. And this is another one where this is a human involving the unalivement of people. Late Tuesday of last week, 71 people were unalived at a funeral, and 18 others were unalived in a separate attack. 71 on Monday, 18 others on Tuesday last week. And these attacks were carried out by the Allied Democratic Force, or the ADF. And those were the latest series of mass attacks on civilians in the troubled region. So we're going to play this video and give you some commentary on the other side.
The eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo is once again in mourning. A fresh wave of violence has swept across the North Kivu region, leaving behind a horrific death toll. On Tuesday evening, authorities announced that 71 people had been killed in Nyoto while attending a funeral on Monday. The next day, terror struck Beni, where 18 more civilians lost their lives in a similar attack. It was 3 a.m. We were asleep when we heard the crackling of bullets. We left the house and fled to hide naked in the forest until morning. In the morning, we came back to see the state of the town, and we were really shocked to learn that several people had been killed. The attackers rampaged through the village, burning homes and looting property, all despite the presence of an army detached nearby. On Wednesday, the bodies of the victims still littered the ground. We have a small army position here. We cannot really say whether they were there or not, because there are really not enough soldiers. They are in Manguripa, but they don't come here to Nyoto. The Congolese army deployed reinforcements to the area on Wednesday in an attempt to reassure a traumatized population. Attacks by ADF rebels have become more frequent in the Beni territory of North Kivu province. Large-scale measures have been taken to ensure that the population does not find itself in tears in this desolation. In a statement Wednesday released by the Prime Minister's office, the government vowed to punish the attackers. Despite joint operations by Congo and Uganda, ADF rebels continue to sow terror and target civilians.
So, Glory. Sorry. So your thoughts on this particular attack, the two attacks on Monday at the funeral and then on Tuesday again with the other 18, 71 at a funeral, 18 again the next day.
Yeah. Deepest condolences to the families of all those affected. We're seeing a pattern that Eastern Congo has endured for years. You know, civilians being struck in the most intimate communal spaces, little warning, minimal state protection. To understand why a funeral became a battlefield, we have to examine two overlapping conflicts. First is the longest insurgency by the ADF, a group that has unalived many, even students and staff at a secondary school as recently as 2023. You know, this group takes advantage of weak roads, takes advantage of thin security deployment, factors that make events like a night funeral tragically vulnerable. Now, the second layer is the conventional war to the south and east against the M23 rebels, which has absorbed Congolese military resources. So as troops left or got redeployed, gaps opened in civilian protection across parts of North Kivu and Ituri. And because of these overlapping wars and withdrawals, the ADF has repeatedly found breathing space. And this explains why displacement in Eastern Congo continues to remain among the highest in the world. So my advice to the authorities, I understand, you know, the urgency with the M23 and all that, but you have to really pay attention to events that are vulnerable, events that are being targeted. It's, you know, that seems like a bigger war, but at the end of the day, if these events keep happening, it does add up, and every life counts, you know. So Congo, it just breaks my heart, you know, when I see Congo in this light, because Congo has become so vulnerable, so vulnerable, and keeps getting, you know, targeted. It's just so sad.
Yeah, and I must say, you know, you notice that there's a theme around the world when it comes to rare earth minerals and or fuel resources, right? There always happens to be fights over these things. We talk about it in the Middle East, and we're talking about it here across the continent of Africa. And so many people have their own personal interests, all of which are funding bad actors, right? Mm-hmm. You mentioned M23, which, you know, the UN has said that Rwanda is backing, right? You have this group here, which you know, who knows who their ties to. There are many talks about who's funding them and who their ties are to. I don't want to speculate, but all of these groups are operating with impunity, and they're unaliving large numbers of people, innocent people. It's not even like they're at war with these people. They're just going through and doing this. And I think this is really, it's sad to see. And, you know, I'd love to see if other neighboring countries could step in and see if they could help the DRC military. The question is, how implicit is the DRC, or complicit is the DRC leadership in all of this? And that's another question that I don't know if I have the answer to, but there seems to be speculation that they are. And so it just feels like the people who are suffering the most are the people who are benefiting the least from those minerals under the ground that they live on. And this is really unfortunate. And it sucks that we're always reporting on another attack in the DRC. It's constant. It's a constant thing. Every week there's a new report. And, you know, what the country that should be the richest in the world, you know, that was on track to becoming a global superpower with an amazing leader more than once, but specifically I'm thinking of, you know, Patrice Lumumba, you know, has fallen into the hands of these folks, all these different people who, in all these different separatist groups and factions that are, you know, doing more harm to the people who have nothing to do with what's going on. So it's sad to see, and it's unfortunate. And I hope that at some point in time, we're not talking about this over and over again, because there's always a news report. But we also want to make sure that you all are aware that this is happening, because it doesn't get the level of discussion that it should. And so we want to make sure that when we're talking about this stuff, and if you guys are following to learn more about what's happening on the continent, that we make sure that we mention it as it's happening. So we have no solutions. We just have more reports on what's happening. And it's unfortunate, but here we are. With that, I want to move on to, that's from Central Africa to Eastern Africa. You know, Ethiopia officially inaugurated Africa's largest hydroelectric dam, a project that'll provide energy to millions of Ethiopians while deepening a rift between them and downstream Egypt and Sudan. And, you know, we can talk about, well, we'll talk about more about this on the other side, but there's a lot of reasons why this is causing challenges in the region. So let me go ahead and play this video, and we'll have some commentary on the other side.
Africa's largest hydroelectric dam, controversial. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is based on a tributary of the River Nile. It's cost around $5 billion and taken over a decade to complete, according to Reuters. The dam is in Ethiopia and has already been generating power for 3 years. Ethiopia has suffered years of internal conflict, and experts say this dam has been a real source of unity for the country. But downstream, Egypt is concerned. The Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt. Already a country that is mostly desert, Egypt's population of about 108 million depends on the Nile for about 90% of its fresh water. And now Egypt fears the new dam could lead to water shortages. Ethiopia's neighbor, Sudan, also has similar fears of being cut off and has joined Egypt's calls for legally binding agreements on the dam's filling and operation. Ethiopia, meanwhile, has repeatedly said that the dam is not a threat and will continue to provide a steady water supply. Why is the inauguration of Africa's...
All right, so now downstream, meaning even though Ethiopia and Sudan are north, they are downstream of Ethiopia because the river flows north, which seems counterintuitive to most people, but rivers can flow in any direction, east, west, north, and south. But yeah, so the river flows north, and so Ethiopia is upstream from Sudan and then subsequently Egypt. So your thoughts on this hydroelectric dam in Ethiopia and the geopolitical implications in the region?
Yeah, so Egypt relies on the Nile for, as was mentioned in the video, for the vast majority of its fresh water. That's about 90% dependency. Sudan's interests actually are not identical to Egypt's, because Sudan can actually gain from regulated flows and power imports, but only if it receives timely data and safety assurances. For Ethiopia, politically, the dam has become a national symbol because they funded it largely through domestic means. Now, the 1997 UN Convention does allow for an equitable and reasonable utilization and the obligation not to cause significant harm. But neither Egypt nor Ethiopia is a party to the convention, even though many still treat those principles as customary international law. I also want to add that having a legally binding agreement, as Egypt and Sudan are asking, won't be sustainable unless there are clear, measurable rules for droughts and verification. If this doesn't happen, the tension will surface every single dry season. So kudos to Ethiopia for this extraordinary achievement, but they need to ensure that while they're enjoying the electricity and all the benefits that this great dam would potentially provide, farmers from Sudan and Egypt do not get affected. People's access to water, etc., do not get affected. And that way it becomes win-win for all. But this overall is historic. We just need to ensure that, other countries are not affected in the process.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, it's this is a feat that took 10 years to create. And in any other instance, you might applaud them and say, congratulations to being able to build something so difficult and really being able to take, electrification into your own hands. I think the problem is, as you said, there are other folks that are likely going to be negatively impacted, right? And so, I know this has been a point of contention for years because they've been working on it for 10 years. And, it seems as though they never really got to an agreement that would either stop it and or potentially positively impact those who are downstream. And so I'd love to see them work together to figure out a solution, because at the end of the day, the fact that many Egyptians, over 90% of their water supply, if I'm not mistaken, comes from the Nile River. That is that's going to be a huge difference to the water they receive and how they receive water, right? How much they receive and where they get it from. Because obviously if they're, and it puts Ethiopia in a position to potentially impact citizens in another country that had nothing to do with the dam, right? And they're just living their everyday lives. And so, I hope that they all come to the table and they're able to work out an equitable process with this, whether they all share in the electricity that's generated and or they share in a better share of how the water is distributed. I don't know what that looks like, but it does seem to me like there are a lot of innocent lives that are going to be impacted, not having anything to do with it. And that's just really unfortunate. All right. So speaking of the Sudans, we're talking to South Sudan in this particular case. They repatriated a Mexican man who was deported from the U.S. in July. So you guys might remember in July, we reported on the U.S. striking a deal with South Sudan to deport migrants to the United States, to Sudan, as one of a few countries on the continent of Africa who agreed to these terms. And so rights groups had argued that the Trump administration's increasing practice of deporting migrants to third countries violated international law and the basic rights of migrants. Well, South Sudan not only received a Mexican man, they also repatriated him to Mexico. And so we are going to watch this video and give some commentary on the other side.
Was among a group of 8 who have been in government custody in the East African country since their deportation from the U.S. His repatriation was done in concert with Mexican authorities, South Sudan said.
I finished my time over there in the United States. I finished my time. They're supposed to report me back to Mexico, but they never made the process. They did it wrong, they did it wrong, and They send me to South Sudan like that, like basically like they kidnapped me.
Rights groups have argued that the Trump administration's increasing practice of deporting migrants to third countries violated international law and the basic rights of migrants. Other African nations receiving deportees from the US include Uganda, Eswatini, and Rwanda.
All right. So thoughts on repatriating this young man to Mexico?
He's in great spirits, considering. That was quite interesting. But it's become, every day becomes more obvious that Africa has become a place for powerful states like the US to test security or migration experiments. You know, the question here is not whether African states can manage migration well, but whether these specific US transfers are procedurally sound and respectful of people's rights. Under US immigration law, if removal to a person's country of nationality is not possible, the government can remove the person to an alternative country that agrees to accept them. Now, the 8 men that were flown to South Sudan in early July were described by the US as admissible to South Sudan under a consent arrangement. South Sudan quickly said some were not its nationals and should be taken back. So after weeks of pressuring and reporting, the Mexican man was returned to US custody. The administration has not publicly detailed the screening process. They haven't talked about the identities or the long-term plan for those who are still in South Sudan. But from a South Sudanese perspective, accepting third country deportees during a humanitarian stressed period is not very helpful. And from a US perspective, there is a reputational cost when a receiving country changes its mind. So once again, the US is in the spotlight over these deportation approaches. But at the end of the day, South Sudan is allowed to change its mind if it sees that a decision is not in its best interest politically.
Yeah, and I mean, look, we'll have another story in a moment, but yeah, you said it all. I think that the idea that the continent of Africa has been agreeing to these kinds of things because there's a monetary gain, or that gives access to the United States, it really does speak to the handout mentality that we're hoping to see go away. Right? You won't agree to something like this if you don't feel like you need the resources that the United States provides. And so I'd love to see our people focus more internally, do better trade deals internally, use collective bargaining to do better trade deals externally outside the continent, and no longer need to do things like this, right? Working it out with the Mexican government to send him to Mexico. I just think it's unusual and unnecessary.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I think we wouldn't be having this conversation if they decided that they weren't going to take him in the first place. And so, I hope to see a day where they don't attempt to do this here. They're not attempting to do it in Europe anywhere. It doesn't seem like anybody in Europe is planning to take him. Australia is not going to take him. Right. So why are African countries taking them? So anyway, on to a story in a similar sense. The Trump administration plans to deport Kilmar Abrego Garcia to Eswatini. So he's been informed that there's now plans to send him to the African nation Eswatini as he continues to fight efforts to re-deport him. So a little bit about the background of who this person is. You might have heard this name, especially if you watch Fox News. But he is an undocumented migrant from El Salvador who fled gang violence and lived in the U.S. years under a protective court order. So he's from El Salvador, came to the U.S., lived in the U.S. under a protective court order. He was wrongfully deported to that mega prison in El Salvador. So the thing is, if you leave your country under the category of political violence and or other potential violence, gang violence, etc., and you look to what's the word I'm looking for now? I've only had 3 hours of sleep. You know, the what's the category when you're fleeing another country and you don't want to go back and you go to the United States? Is the asylum, right? So under asylum, right? The idea is that you are not to be deported. If they're going to deport you, you cannot be deported back to your country of origin, right? And so the woman who actually, or the person who mentioned to the press that they made the mistake and they deported him to El Salvador was fired that next day because they weren't supposed to say that they made that mistake. But there was already a court order not to deport him back there. In any case, it triggered a high-profile legal battle that ended in his return to face federal charges. So he came back to the United States, and now he's going to be potentially re-deported, but this time to Eswatini. Now there were accusations that he had gang ties. In 2019, he was detained by police because he was working as a day laborer. He was picked up, I think, outside of Home Depot with a couple of other people who, you know, they kind of all gather together, generally at Home Depot to try to get work. I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked, who've ever gone to Home Depot to buy things to work on your house. This is a common thing around the United States. You go to Home Depot, you don't want to pay an American worker $20 an hour. So you see some of these guys sitting outside of Home Depot and you might say, hey, can you put this shed together for me or whatever? So people do that. It's a common thing all over the United States. He was picked up along with other folks standing outside of a Home Depot. He was classified with those folks. Apparently one of them, from what I understand, may have had gang ties. And the presumption was that because he was standing with him looking for work outside of Home Depot, he also did too. From what I understand, there's no proof that he was an MS-13 gang member or he had any gang members affiliation in his social media or anywhere else, but he had been picked up by affiliation next to someone standing outside of a Home Depot. In any case, we will watch this video and we will have some commentary on this other side. We just wanted to give you some background on this individual and what actually happened. So here we go.
The Trump administration says it plans to deport Kilmar Abrego Garcia to Eswatini, a small country in South Africa. Abrego Garcia is fighting the effort to re-deport him and has raised concerns about being deported to other countries. Earlier this year, he spent weeks imprisoned in his home country of El Salvador after he was mistakenly deported. Abrego Garcia is currently in ICE custody after being brought back to the U.S. to face human smuggling charges. Last week, a federal judge ruled he can't be deported until at least early October.
So, and I did neglect to mention there were new charges, right? There was the human smuggling charges now that I see, because I think it was originally charges of MS-13 affiliation. Now there are new charges of human smuggling, like a coyote or something to that effect. So your thoughts on this re-deportation effort that looks like they're trying to have with Kilmar Abrego Garcia?
Yeah, you can see that Eswatini is actually, they're showing the human rights and due process concerns more harshly. The 5 men deported there in mid-July were immediately held in solitary confinement. The government stated that it intended to repatriate them to their respective home countries, implying that Eswatini is acting as a transit custodian, not a final destination. There was public outrage in Eswatini and confusion about how and why deportees with no ties to Eswatini were sent there. But I am concerned about the example that is actually being set. Once a country serves as a place for third country removals, it may face pressure to accept more over time. Also, agreeing to receive US deportees, even if it's just temporarily, can unlock goodwill, aid, you can get investment, but it can also generate domestic backlash if the public views it as outsourcing another country's policy problems, as has been the case in all these countries we've been hearing about that have been receiving these migrants.
Yeah, all great points. You know, I don't want to repeat anything I said previously. I think the last thing I'll just say here is, you know, look, the administration obviously admitted already that they had made a mistake sending him to El Salvador in the first place. And you saw an image, a quick image of how he was treated in CICAT in El Salvador. What you didn't see or hear about is the harsh punishment that they continue to do to people in CICAT. And, you know, look, El Salvador is a different case. We're not here to talk about El Salvador in general and what has happened in that country because, you know, many people are praising him for getting MS-13 off the streets, et cetera, et cetera. But there is no due process. As with what you were saying had happened with solitary confinement with these folks in Eswatini, there's no due process in these systems, right? What we're talking about is, and the reason for that is the idea for those who support this say that American citizens are the only ones that deserve due process. So if you are on American soil, you do not deserve due process. Only American citizens on American soil deserve due process. But if you look at the Constitution and all the different things that are associated with how this country was built, and many of it, you know, I have challenges with, they did speak to the fact that, and many people interpret it as all people should have these inalienable rights. They're just speaking specifically that they can only have that jurisdiction over the contiguous, well, not the contiguous, but all 50 United States, because 2 are not connected, right? And its territories. So if that's the case, then that means people on the ground in the United States should also be given that same courtesy. And it's just not the case, right? And so that to me is another concern that I see here is there is no due process. And it's a way to move through a process without due process, because you can say, well, these aren't American citizens, so we don't have to follow those same rules we do follow with American citizens on American soil. And that is a slippery slope, because you can imagine who could be next, right? Mm-hmm. All right, next we're going to move to Rwanda making history. What can be seen as a positive story coming out of Rwanda, because there have been a lot of challenges. Now, my question is, you know, where do the resources come from to be able to build such things? But let's
China.
speak to or the pieces where their neighboring country. Some of those pieces come from the neighboring country, right? The government of Rwanda, in partnership with the China Road and Bridge Corporation, is set to debut Africa's first ever public flight of a self-flying electric taxi at the Aviation Africa 2025 Summit. And so, yes, it looks like China and Chinese engineers worked with them, but I wonder where the materials came from. Where were they? Where nearby did those materials come from?
Nearby.
In any case, I will play this video and we'll have some commentary on the other side.
And Rwanda has carried out the public flight of a self-flying electric car taxi in the country, the first of its kind in the African continent. Well, the successful demonstration took place during the Aviation Africa 2025 Summit in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. Now, Rwanda now joins other countries that are also test-driving electric self-flying air taxis, including China, Germany, the Dominican Republic, Israel, and the United States. Rwanda employed the Ihang EH-216S aircraft, which is described as a sleek, futuristic drone with 16 propellers and 2 passenger capacity. In this demonstration, the taxi drone climbed to an altitude of around 100 meters, completing its pre-programmed route before making a vertical landing. The demonstration of this new technology was jointly undertaken by Rwandan and Chinese firms, and according to a statement by the Rwandan Ministry of Infrastructure, the initiative solidifies the East African nation's position as Africa's hub for testing and implementing cutting-edge aviation technology. With Rwanda's test flight emerging as a major milestone for Africa, the country still needs to develop regulatory frameworks to govern its operations. A full commercial service in Rwanda will still have to wait some more.
So your thoughts, Gloria?
I can't get over that question you asked. But anyway, yay Rwanda, yay Africa. I do love how innovation focused Rwanda has been. And this is yet another major stride in aerospace. Rwanda continues to position itself not just as a regional leader, but as a global example of what deliberate, well-governed innovation can actually achieve. This is about solving problems with futuristic, scalable solutions. Now, even though this might come with a higher price point initially, it is a great step towards addressing long-standing challenges like traffic congestion, the physical limits of traditional road networks, air mobility, if carefully implemented, could really elevate the quality of urban life for many people in Rwanda. Now, that said, my recommendation would be for the government to proactively explore ways to subsidize this technology, perhaps through public-private partnerships or innovation grants. This way, it doesn't become yet another elite service that can only be accessible by the privileged few, such as Joe. Rwanda's strength has, to be fair, always been its ability to build inclusive policy frameworks. So this should be no exception. For this to serve the broader Rwandan population and not just business travelers or diplomats, equity must be built into the deployment strategy from day one. Also, it is very important that strong enforceable regulatory mechanisms are put in place, as she referenced in the video, to instill public confidence, because we're talking air travel, okay? Mm-hmm. The rules have to be clear. There should be routine maintenance protocols. There should be independent oversight in the rollout, not after the fact. If all these elements are put in place, this could be a defining moment, not just for Rwanda, but for Africa's place in aerospace, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, I'll say, I am impressed by the functionality and, what has been built.
Right.
Where I run into some challenges is, what is this at the expense of, right? Rwanda's rapid advancement in a lot of cases could be seen at the expense of what's happening in the DRC, right? And, all of the materials that you see in this flying drone come from the ground next door to Rwanda, right? Which is what I was discussing. So that does give me pause. I think that is something that look, I'd love to see Africa advance like this. This is the kind of thing you'd love to see. Now, there are concerns about air traffic control and safety and weather and things like that. I mean, we have challenges already dealing with traffic on ground. Now we're talking about multiple layers, multiple vehicles. You need air traffic control. You need vehicles that can be able to speak to each other. There's a lot of things that will need to be implemented in terms of policies, but then also they'll need to be enforced. And so that does concern me, because if we see so many accidents happening on the ground, it does concern me about what that means otherwise. However, with advancement like this, you can see other types of advancements, delivery of medical services to people in rural villages. That's where I see the use of technology like this. If you can bring people to places quicker, emergency services to areas where roads are not very well built, right? So you can fly a doctor in from somewhere that is a little bit more urban to a place that's more rural, that doesn't have roads for them to get to. So somebody doesn't have to experience loss of life for something that could have been solved if they were just closer in proximity to a hospital that had a doctor that was equipped to be able to help them. So for me, I see that as the benefit, and I would love to see how it could be implemented in those sectors, right? You mentioned public-private partnerships, but I also expect that the government thinks about things like that. And as you said, it's not just a way for wealthy people who come to Rwanda to be able to get around because they don't want to sit in traffic. So I'd like to see that, and I hope that that is how they implement it. But it does give me pause to know that they could be at the expense of other folks, in stories that we've already addressed earlier today. So those are the major headlines from around the continent that we talked about, or that we were going to talk about today. I know that there were some additional headlines that we wanted you all to check out on your own and in your own free time. I'll turn it over to you, Gloria, if there's anyone's in particular that you wanted to speak to before we draw this live stream to a close.
Yes, let's start with Mali. There's actually a very big story that happened over the weekend. An Al-Qaeda linked group, Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, JNIM for short, declared a blockade on fuel imports and destroyed tanker trucks mid-transit in southern Mali's Sikasso region. So the aim was to actually disrupt vital supply routes into Bamako and choke the capital's energy lifeline, escalating pressure on the military junta. So the military struck back, and that was what led to that. If you've seen in the news that Mali had some military strikes, that was why they did it, because of the blockage on their fuel. So that did happen. And still in Mali, in a domestic escalation, Mali filed a formal case against Algeria at the International Court of Justice. So Mali is accusing Algeria of violating Malian airspace and sovereignty by shooting down a military drone earlier this year. The dispute comes following Mali's withdrawal from ECOWAS and increasing allegations that Algeria is harboring or backing Tuareg separatists. Now, while Algeria claims the drone posed a national security threat, Mali insists that the act was unprovoked aggression. So those are two stories from Mali.
And I'll just add.
No,
I'll just say that, you guys should really look into these a little bit more, because, this is an Al-Qaeda sponsored group that blew up that did that blockade. And what I would also mention is that this is the reason why one of the reasons why military leadership ended up in leadership, why you had these revolutions, because they felt like the previous leadership wasn't doing anything to stop these groups, and they're getting funding from outside parties, and they're causing real problems and real harm to the population there. So definitely look into these stories and check out what's going on, especially if what Mali is saying is true, and in particular when it comes to their neighbors to the west.
All righty. In Uganda, Uganda is once again in the international spotlight as mounting allegations of enforced disappearance, arbitrary detentions, and torture of opposition figures fuel renewed calls for an international criminal court investigation into President Yoweri Museveni's regime. The government has dismissed the ICC push as foreign meddling. All right. Yeah, Zambia has convicted its former foreign affairs minister, Joseph Malangi, on charges of possessing property suspected to be proceeds of crime. The ruling follows President Hakainde Hichilema's high-profile pledge to clean up public service and recover looted state resources. Malangi, who denied wrongdoing, has become one of the most prominent political figures to be sentenced under this government's watch.
Yeah. Seems to be a normal process. New administration comes in, people from the previous administration get convicted of corruption. Seems to be the norm.
Yes. Finally, Nigeria and India are deepening energy ties through a new phase of direct oil trade agreements. The aim is to bypass Western intermediaries and stabilize costs. Now, with Nigeria seeking to diversify its buyers and India actually being hungry for reliable crude supplies, the two countries are exploring long-term contracts settled in rupees and naira. That way they're able to reduce dependency on the dollar.
Yeah, and I wonder, this seems like it's like flirting with Nigeria being a part of BRICS, right? This is like the trading with the BRICS +6 kind of thing that's happening now. So let's keep an eye on how much more some of these other companies Nigeria continues to expand its trade partnerships with.
Trump is not going to like that.
That's all. Any other stories?
That's all, Joe. Do you have
All right.
anything to share?
That's all, folks. That's it. One thing that I will make mention of, because it's in the world news now, and it's not an African news story, but I will say this. There were two major violent attacks yesterday in the United States, as it pertains to gun violence. And, the continent of Africa rarely sees these kinds of things because most of the continent has strict gun laws. Where you see gun violence is in South Africa because they have less strict gun laws. And so it is something that I think that we should all be thinking about. And whatever side of the political aisle you're on, wherever you are, this should give you pause to some degree. Because this is something that really, it's an epidemic now. So that's one thing. Also, this is September 11th, and it is the anniversary of many folks losing their lives, September 11th, 2001. So, I've been to the September 11th memorial many times. It seems like every time a family member of mine comes to New York, that's somewhere that we go. And you see all the names of people who experienced loss of life on that day in some of the most horrific ways. And so I also want to say that, those of you who experienced any loss on that day, we are thinking about you. It is a tragic, it was a tragic moment in American history, in the world history, period. I'm not going to speculate or any of that because people do that all the time. I'm just going to say that, this is something that I think about on this day. I happen to be in Pennsylvania that day when one of the planes went down. I remember being a senior in high school and watching it. We stopped our day, like at school. It was like in the middle of like after first period or like right at first period. We kind of all just stopped and we were just watching the TV screens and seeing what was happening. You'll never forget where you were that day. I have a friend of mine who was in New York City when it happened. And he actually was, blocks away from where it happened. Another family member who was going to work that day. And luckily for him, he hadn't made it to work yet. He was running late, but he was actually in one of the Twin Towers. That's where he was working. And so he's here today because he happened to be late for work that day, but he may not have been around to see his children grow up. And so, yeah, I do think about it every year when this comes around, because it's one of those things that you just never expected to happen, and it changed the world forever. I mean, TSA, all of that stuff, how things happen at the airport is all because of these kinds of things. So, just wanted to bring our attention to those things, make sure that we're not forgetting them. And we think about ways to solve for those kinds of things in the future, regardless of where you stand on any of these topics.
Yes.
So with that, thanks for watching. If you watched all the way to the end of this video, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to @TheGloriaAO on YouTube, Instagram, and everywhere else. If you are from Gloria's social followings, head over to Authentic African and subscribe and follow on all the platforms that we're on. Make sure if you found this if you found this interesting, hit that thumbs up, share this with anybody you know who could use some insight into what's happening on the continent. And we will see you back all again next Thursday for our next live stream. So thanks again, guys. See you all on the next video. Bye, guys.